The political project of Tiberius Gracchus, as remembered by Plutarch, is as relevant to our contemporary crisis as it's ever been, writes Plutarch in Parallel Lives. Quote, "When the rich began to offer larger rents and drove out the poor, a law was enacted forbidding the holding by one person of more than 500 acres of land. For a short time this enactment gave a check to the rapacity of the rich and was of assistance to the poor. But later on, the neighboring rich men, by means of fictional personages, transferred these rentals to themselves and finally held most of the land openly in their own names."
You should try farming. You can make a fortune out here. Just grab some land.
You can't just take someone's land.
Bill Gates has been snatching up 242,000 acres of farmland across the U.S., enough to make him the top private farmland owner in America.
So, concentration of ownership over land took place first illegally, and then eventually the illegality of it was simply flaunted.
Just grab some land.
Just grab some land.
Then the poor, who had been ejected from their land, no longer showed themselves eager for military service, and neglected the bringing up of children.
Do you know, I met a family coming here. Someone had grabbed their land. The woman was screaming the place down.
Well, the army took her husband.
Here we have the military recruitment crisis and the demographic crisis, which much of the West is facing as well, so that soon all Italy was conscious of a dearth of free men, and was filled with gangs of foreign slaves, by whose aid the rich cultivated their estates, from which they had driven away the free citizens." End quote. It was in response to this that Tiberius Gracchus passed a law forcing the rich to vacate the ill-begotten land. And Plutarch preserves a speech of his, or reproduces his general arguments. Quote, "The wild beasts that roam over Italy have every one of them a cave or lair to lurk in. But the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy the common air and light, indeed, but nothing else. Houseless and homeless, they wander about with their wives and children. They fight and die to support others in wealth and luxury. And though they are styled masters of the world, they have not a single clod of earth that is their own." End quote. Here what we have is a clear case of the old core demographic being dispossessed, styled as masters of the world because they happen to be in the world metropolis, so to speak, but completely disenfranchised by elites whose interests are not tied to the core body politique any longer. And you can think of European and American working and middle classes in much the same way. And again, quote, "When Tiberius observed the dearth of inhabitants in the country, and that those who tilled its soil or tended its flocks there were barbarian slaves, he then first conceived the public policy which was the cause of countless ills to the two brothers," to him and his brother. In other words, that caused such a strong political reaction by the establishment against them. So he came up with his policy proposals because he saw that locals were no longer tilling the land. Quote, "The energy and ambition of Tiberius were mostly of all kindled by the people themselves, who posted writings on porticos, house walls, and monuments, calling upon him to recover for the poor the public land." End quote. This project to re-enfranchise the natives precisely opposed the invade the world, invite the world dynamic. Don't predate on foreigners, militarily or economically, and give your own people at home access to productive resources and wealth. And we can support entrepreneurial folks increasing their property, of course, nothing wrong with that, but we're talking about treason against the native people of a territory and the setting up of exploitative labor. Gracchus was not against empire. When the Senate refused to fund his land commission, he controversially used the treasury of a recently annexed kingdom, Bargamum, to finance his reforms. And he wasn't against the army, just the opposite. He wanted a strong army of enfranchised Roman citizens. From Appian, Civil Wars, quote, Tiberius asked whether it was not just to let the commons divide the common property, whether a citizen was not worthy of more consideration at all times than a slave, whether a man who served in the army was not more useful than one who did not, and whether one who had a share in the country was not more likely to be devoted to the public interests. Now that last point is key. The Romans possessed most of their territory by conquest, and that they had hopes of occupying the rest of the habitable world. But now the question of greatest hazard was whether they should gain the rest by having plenty of brave men, or whether through their weakness and mutual jealousy their enemies should take away what they already possessed. So, whether one who had a share in the country was not more likely to be devoted to the public interests, that's key, because it means that we should enfranchise through property the citizenry. Not just heighten purchasing power, increase salaries, but make sure that people are grounded, that they own literal, as well as in other areas, ground. And then this idea that it should be brave men who own a stake in the country that make up its military. That was the way it was done. But for Gracchus, according to Appian, the kind of empire that expands through slave labor is in fact one in which the Roman has been overcome. Mastery, Romanitas, cannot be a replacement of Roman by foreign slave. But we have here the idea of citizenship as embodied. There's an element of compensating you for the sacrifice of your ancestors. In a sense, you are a shareholder in the nation and should have a return on the investment that your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents have made in building it up. And there's this idea that physical space expresses identity. Identity is not a purely mental exercise. It should have some physical substrate. We don't divorce the physical world from our inner world of mental identification. And we could apply this idea of enfranchisement also to a different kind of space, to virtual space. And that's where the AI oligarchy might be a problem. Now, we should also understand what Appian reports of Gracchus about wanting world empire in the light of what we know he did when negotiating with conquered people, the Numantines. On his peace negotiations, Plutarch describes a scene deserving of artistic canonization. Quote, in the first place, the Numantines set out a meal for him and entreated him by all means to sit down and eat something in their company. Next, they gave him back his tablets and urged him to take whatever he wanted of the rest of his property, what they had taken as booty prior to this. He took nothing, however, except the frankincense, which he was wont to use in public sacrifices, and after bidding them farewell with every expression of friendship, he departed. End quote. Now, the tablets mentioned here are his ledger, containing written accounts of the official expenses, his official expenses as quaestor. These he was very anxious to recover. The Numantines, accordingly delighted at the chance to do him a favor, invited him to enter the city. And so they entered with clasped hands and fervently entreated him to no longer regard them as enemies, but to treat and trust them as friends. And he decided to do so, end quote. So we have a shared meal, frankincense for ritual observance, for religious ceremonies, and his records, the tablets. All of these items kind of have a biblical resonance. Sharing a meal together, burning frankincense, the book, they're kind of symbols of reconciliation, of empire in a non-predatory key, of diplomacy. Tiberius negotiated a second peace treaty with Numancia, which, though rejected by the Roman Senate, would many centuries later resonate with Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote. In his play, The Siege of Numancia, he dramatizes a speech by one of the Numantine negotiators, quote, Numancia, of which I am a citizen, illustrious general, and he's speaking to Scipio Africanus, I believe, in this scene, sends me to request your friendship, It was a stubborn and cruel persistence over many years that caused Numancia's troubles as well as your own. Our city would never have departed from the law and privilege given her by the Roman Senate if not for the torpid command and outrages committed by one consul after another. With unjust statutes and avarice, these did put so heavy a yoke on our necks that we were left with no choice but to drive them off." End quote. So Cervantes' ideal of local autonomy, together with participation and integration in imperial civilization, is precisely the arrangement that Tiberius attempted to bring about. The universal balanced with the local, the imperial balanced with the indigenous imperatives. Tiberius Gracchus, along with figures like Cincinnatus, in a sense, represents Numa's peaceful rule of Rome as a sort of enlightened philosopher king who did not go to war. It's the federalism of Plato's laws, where each city-state retains its own identity, but is able to pool together a wider Hellenic identity and economies of scale in order to defend itself against something like a future Persian imperial behemoth. All this also resonates with the better aspects of medieval Christendom: decentralization, communality, etc. On Gracchus as the would-be restorer of Numa Pompilius's Rome, consider the following. This is from Plutarch's chapter on Numa. Quote, "Rome's territory was not extensive at first, but Romulus acquired most of it later with the spear, with warfare. All this was distributed by Numa among the indigent citizens." End quote. So land distribution sets Rome off. Gracchus, then, is not some later democratic innovation, but a return to the philosopher King Numa's founding vision. He's both the democrat and the reactionary. Quote, "Numa wished to remove the destitution which drives men to wrongdoing and to return the people to agriculture, that they might be subdued and softened along with the soil they tilled. For there is no other occasion which produces so keen and quick a relish for peace as that of a farmer's life, where so much of the warrior's daring as prompts a man to fight for his own is always preserved." The farmer, the yeoman, the landowner, has that warrior instinct because he wants to defend his property, while the warrior's license to indulge in rapacity and injustice is extirpated. End quote. He's not engaged in hard work to steal someone else's land, territory, wealth. He's not a pirate. He's not raiding caravans. He's growing his own wealth. So a landowner has the warrior's daring in him because he is prompted to fight for his own. He's enfranchised. He has a stake in the society by owning productive resources, owning capital, namely fertile land. And we can extend this principle to other kinds of capital too, but the point is that if you're part of a community, at least the head of your family should own a literal piece of that community's economic capacity. We shouldn't just settle for being employees and having a stake in our nation, but shareholders. We should own a share. Quote, "Numa, therefore, administering agriculture to his citizens as a sort of peace potion, and well pleased with the art as fostering character rather than wealth, divided the city's territory into districts, to which he gave the name of pagi, and in each of them he set observers and patrols. But sometimes he would inspect them in person, and judging of the characters of the citizens from the condition of their farms, would advance some to positions of honor and trust, while others who were indolent and careless, he would chide and reproach, and so try to make them sensible." End quote. So these pagi are land allotments, very similar to Leviticus, the same sort of sacred order, and they belong to you specifically or your family specifically. And if you do a good job, it reflects well on you, and if you're lazy, it reflects poorly on you. Property owning democracy, co-nationals as landowners, and Gracchus as a restorer of the true Rome, against importing foreign slaves, against subjugating others for the sake of displacing the native worker, giving the Roman his share of Italian soil. Alas, in 133 BC, Gracchus was assassinated by politician rabble, a mob of senators The excuse was that he had made a move towards becoming king, reverting Rome to the old monarchy, and indeed he was popular enough to have done so, but apparently he had not. Quote, Tiberius put his hand to his head, making this visible sign that his life was in danger, but his opponents on seeing this ran to the Senate and told them that Tiberius was asking for a crown. End quote. Gracchus was now to meet his end, the same end as Julius Caesar more than a century later. Quote, but the senators themselves seized the fragments and legs of the benches that were shattered by the crowd in its flight, and went up against Tiberius, at the same time smiting those who were drawn up to protect him. Of these there was a rout and a slaughter. More than 300 were slain by blows from sticks and stones, but not one by the sword. End quote. No sword, because not a one was a man. Thus ends Tiberius Gracchus, spiritual heir to Numa, rightful king of Rome, symbol for a different kind of Imperium. The tribunate of Tiberius's brother Gaius, from 123 to 22 BC, would see him implement a lot of the reforms that his brother Tiberius had advocated for and meet with the same end. Spengler does see Gracchus, Tiberius, and his brother Gaius as somehow precursors to Caesarism. Traditionally, the Senate held control over legislative matters, but Tiberius took his proposals directly to the plebeian assembly, bypassing senatorial approval, and this was a radical move. Quote, the tribune was the legitimate successor of the tyrant. Caius Gracchus had put into the title a connotation limited no longer by the legal bounds of the office, but only by the personal talents of the incumbent. From him it is a direct line through Marius and Caesar and Nero. But where Caesar reabsorbs economic power into the state to break the oligarchs, Gracchus would distribute their assets, also to break them, also strengthening the state in some sense. But for this reason, perhaps, Spengler sees the inauguration of Caesarism in Julius Caesar as aligned with the seasons of history, in the case of Roman history, whereas Gracchus is at odds with history. Times like our own and the Gracchian age, in which there are two most deadly kinds of idealism, the reactionary and the democratic, the one who believes in the reversibility of history, the other in a teleology of history. But it makes no difference to the inevitable failure with which both burden a nation over whose destiny they have power. A lot of people commented on my Trump isn't Caesar video that Trump was less Caesar than a Gracchus. Of course, Oswald Spengler's Caesarism doesn't refer exclusively to Julius or Octavian. I see where people were coming from, but I don't think he is a Gracchus. I think he will probably end up being an extension of Spengler's pre-Caesarist phase of history, which he calls civilization, when certain institutions, again in Spengler, outgrow the state. Like the financial sector, they outgrow the state. They pursue their interests in opposition to those of the body politique proper. Caesarism comes after that. It abrogates, it reabsorbs. But this looks like a second wind for the civilization phase, the fusion or the conquest of the state by big tech. It's not Spenglerian Caesarism, and certainly not Gracchus. Rather, a partnership with big tech in which existing companies increase their assets and become enmeshed in the economy and government to a greater degree. David Sachs isn't divesting from Kraft Venture to serve as AI czar, for example. So it isn't Caesar taming private interest. And it may be that the state is now too small compared to outgrowths like big tech. That's partly perhaps the lesson to draw from MAGA. So what would Gracchianism look like today? Well, that deserves its own exploration, but certainly something like Lincoln's Homestead Act, a massive devolution of productive resources to the family, neighborhood, municipal level in a sort of Chestertonian distributist key, open source technology. And you would have to make this compatible with a strong industrial policy, productive investment, economies of scale, and so on. This video really goes through a lot of the things I've dealt with before, but I wanted to revisit it, focused on Tiberius Gracchus. Okay, I hope that was interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you would like to. There's links in the description for ways to help the channel. I very much appreciate it. And until next time.